Hello, I'm Andrew, and welcome to the next installment in my Sicilian Dragon Masterclass series. We have covered all of the main lines. I am giving bishop c4 its own video because it is frequent enough that we do need to give it some serious consideration. I'm calling it the Javelin variation here for the sake of making it slightly easier to remember, but if that's not helpful, then you can just refer to it as the bishop c4 variation. As far as I'm aware, it doesn't have a name. So we arrive at the bishop c4 variation after e4, c5, now knight f3, the open Sicilian, d6, d4, c takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, and now bishop to c4. If you're unsure as to how we have reached this position, take a look at the introductory video in this series. So from here, Black wants to continue as normal and play bishop to g7. White will normally castle, and we will castle, and this is what I would like to treat as the starting position in the bishop c4 variation. But before we delve into this, I just want to talk about some opportunities for transposition that White has. If they were to play bishop to e3 and we were to castle, and then they were to play f3 and we played knight to c6 and they played queen to d2, you should recognize this position by now. This is the Yugoslav variation where rather than castling, White has committed their bishop to c4. Of course, they just played bishop to c4 a lot earlier. Now the continuation is bishop to d7, and after castles, now we have rook to c8, followed by, after bishop to b3, knight takes on d4 ideas or knight to e5 ideas. If you're unfamiliar with all of this, you need to be taking a look at episode 2 in this series on the Yugoslav variation. They could also reach this same position simply by playing f3 first and then bishop e3. I'm not going to go down that line because, again, if you've already watched episode 2, that should be very clear. Now, if you're feeling particularly brave, after bishop e3, you can remain equal after knight to g4, looking to win the dark squared bishop. Now, there is this very annoying bishop to b5 check, where if we play knight to c6, we are losing material. Again, this should be a familiar continuation from episode 2, and we cannot play bishop to d7 because, again, we looked at this in episode 2, the bishop is now pinned to the king. We've just lost a piece. But if you really want to catch your opponent off guard, you can play king f8 here and still be equal. So your opponent might continue by castling. You could chop off the bishop, giving your opponent doubled pawns, and now after a move like bishop to e5, creating space for your king and preparing the move f6, because of course the very natural attacking and developing move queen f3 looks to be on the horizon, we could now play f6, and I think after something like knight to d5 for White, which is very strong, White does win the majority of games here in the Lichess database. It's not a position that is frequently arrived at, but it is entirely equal. So if you want to catch your opponent off guard with some monstrous preparation, and maybe lure them into thinking they have a psychological edge on you, and that you're in a kind of risky position that you're unfamiliar with, but in fact you know it inside and out, then this might be a fantastic line to explore in your own time. I think the best continuation here is bishop to d7, bishop takes, queen takes, and we are okay here. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because it is quite tricky to traverse. So what I would recommend if they play bishop to e3 is just castling. And again, we might transpose into those Yugoslav lines, or they might castle short. And now this is what we're looking at. After we play g6, they play bishop to c4. We play bishop to g7. They castle, we castle, bishop to e3, just via a different move order. But this is one of the moves that we're going to look at, as I said, from this position that I'm going to consider the key starting position of the bishop c4 lines. So here the moves I want to look at are rook to e1, the bishop developing to e3, the bishop developing to d2, and we can just very quickly also discuss just a slow waiting move like h3. Let's tackle bishop to d2 because this isn't challenging at all. In fact, this is a mistake from our opponent. Why? Because we can go ahead and grab this pawn in the center. We're just winning the pawn. And if they decide to capture back, there are two ways to continue here. We could grab this knight. This does allow for bishop to h6, attacking our rook. And then after we drop back, you know, we're maybe losing one of our better pieces here. So you might also wish to proceed by utilizing the fork with the move d5. And now, yeah, you're just in a great position. If they take, obviously you're recapturing with the queen, and if they move, let's say, you know, just their bishop to c3 or something, and you win the bishop, then you're just up a pawn here, doing very well with a lot of pressure on this knight, looking to play further developing moves and just and have a great game from this position. Black has a 1-point advantage here. Let's take a look at bishop to e3. So again, we're going to want to jump after this bishop whenever our opponent gives us the opportunity to do so. And if they retreat the bishop so that they hold on to it, well, now we can actually just place the knight on e5, where it fares very well attacking our opponent's light squared bishop. And we don't even need to do that immediately because it hasn't been kicked yet and it's still well defended by our bishop. So we can just develop knight to c6. Now, we are obviously exerting a lot of pressure on d4. If the knight moves to f3, we want to treat this pawn as though it were an isolated pawn because it doesn't have a neighbor on the d file, and for the time being, it cannot be protected by f3 because the knight is situated on f3, which leads us to the move b6. This is one of the only lines in the Dragon where we look to confidently develop this bishop on b7, where it cuts across the center. We would maybe blockade this pawn while also winning a tempo on this bishop. Maybe it would drop back to d3 to look after the pawn on e4 perhaps, but yeah, black has all of the attacking initiative in this game. I've just included bishop to f4 and bishop to b7, h3, and now we can even go after this bishop before retreating our own bishop to f6 in this particular line, because now our opponent does have quite a lot of firepower. Okay, so that is what occurs after bishop to e3. We chase it away with knight g4 and the knight comes to f3. It could also retreat to b3, but now again, we're looking to situate that knight on e5, winning a tempo on our opponent's bishop that's now going to have to drop back because it can't utilize the b3 square because the knight is there. And we just have lovely easy development here. We can play f5, and if they capture, develop our bishop to f5. These are incredible pieces. We'd have nothing to worry about here. Okay, so that's bishop to e3, and that is bishop to d2. What happens if they play something like rook to e1? Well, we can develop our knight to c6. If they trade off here, as always, this is just very good for us. It makes d5 a lot easier to play. Our bishop will become very strong on this diagonal once this knight has moved. It's nice and simple and nothing to worry about. It is equal at worst and better at best. Okay, so let's say they move the knight back to b3. Well, I really enjoy this line where there are two ways to go about this. You can play a6 first and allow our opponent to play a4, but I think there's no point in wasting time. You can just play bishop to g4, immediately attacking their queen, inducing f3 as a weakness. Now the dark squares are becoming easy for us to exploit, and now we will hop the knight into e5, hoping that if they capture here, we will be winning their bishop, and after their bishop retreats somewhere like bishop to e2 or bishop to f1, now we can situate our bishop on e6, where it is very strong for the rest of the game. As I say, if we play a6 first, then they can play a4, and we can go after the same idea. But I just think there's no need to allow our opponent to sensibly play a4. We might as well just go for this bishop g4 attack right away. So that's if the knight comes back to b3. But what if instead of that the bishop comes back to b3? Well, now we can just develop our bishop to d7, and after a move like bishop to g5 and rook c8, if they trade off here, this is absolutely fine for us. And if something like knight to d5, we can chop down all of these pieces, and we would be happy for them to take here and activate our pieces. And if they don't, we can just play c5 and have nice control over d4. This pawn is a little bit overextended. The bishop has all kinds of potential on all kinds of diagonales. There's nothing to worry about here. Going back, what if in this position they just play a waiting move like h3? Well, now we can chop this knight off, and I am offering you two continuations here. One is to play the knight back to d7, exposing an attack on our opponent's queen, and when that queen moves out the way, we can plant the knight on e5. Or, slightly more precise, I think, is just to develop the bishop to d7, looking to swing the rook to the c-file. Don't hang this pawn. And when our opponent preempts a discovered attack on the queen and moves it out the way, we can play something like a6, preventing all of these shenanigans, and yeah, lock our bishop in on c6. Targeting this pawn, rooks will come to their natural files, and we will have a very good game, as always, from this position. That means there's only really one more thing to cover, which is what if they just play something like h3 here right now? We'll just develop the knight. And again, if they capture, they make our life very easy for us. And if they don't, we are likely to transpose into some of the ideas that we have already been taking a look at. If they play bishop to e3 now, you could go and harass this piece. You can play a6 to prevent pieces hopping in here with bishop to d7 ideas and rook c8. The reason this is not a particularly complex variation for our opponent to play is just it's so easy to navigate purely by synthesizing everything that we've learned from the more challenging main lines. The only uniqueness to it, I suppose, is there are a lot more lines where we're hopping the knight here and then hopping it back to e5 and utilizing that outpost, but it's relatively straightforward. You are, of course, much less likely to be pushing for f5 breaks as long as this bishop remains on this diagonal, but we've already looked at various different ways that we can chase this bishop away. So one more episode on 6th move sidelines, then we will be looking at some model games. And then I thought what I would actually do is add some bonus chapters where we take a quick look at the accelerated dragon and the hyper accelerated dragon, just so that you can understand how in the middle game they differ from the classic way of playing with d6 first. I hope you've enjoyed the video and that it has proven very useful. Please like, comment, and subscribe. That really helps give my channel a great big healthy boost. Take care, and as always, I will see you in the next one.